heard my own name spoken in the dark, in my mother's voice, though she had been dead 10 years and no lips moved near me. The night air above the dunes quivered, as if with heat, yet the sand under my palms felt cold as stone. Henderson's lantern guttered without wind. Around our camp, the desert whispered in a dozen tongues, all wrong, all ours, all at once. Men have pressed me, in clubs and drawing rooms, to set these matters down, though I sometimes wish silence had remained my only companion. If you would hear more, lend me your attention, mark your assent, and when I have done, tell me which road you would have taken, and whether you too have heard voices where no man stood. To understand what we encountered, I must return to the winter of 1923 and to the empty quarter north of Berbera, where the maps of the survey still showed more blankness than line. I had been attached to the British Somaliland Survey as a junior cartographic officer, seconded from the Royal Engineers. My name matters little now. In the records, I am one more minor functionary. At that time, however, I possessed the untroubled conviction of youth that any landscape, however hostile, might be rendered harmless once reduced to elevations and coordinates upon vellum. We left Berbera on the 14th of January 1923. Our small party comprised Captain Edward Henderson of the survey, nominally in command, myself, a medical officer, Dr. Charles Avery, and a political officer from the Protectorate Administration, Mr. Lionel Marsh. We had with us 12 Somali askaris as escort and 6 camel men, all of them seasoned in desert travel. Our purpose was prosaic: to extend triangulation points towards the horde and to verify certain water sources reported by nomadic clans. Our equipment was of the usual sort: prismatic compasses, aneroid barometers, a theodolite whose brass fittings gleamed obstinately in the sun, canvas waterskins, Lee Enfield rifles, a heliograph, and 2 cumbersome petrol lanterns that Henderson insisted upon, though the camel men muttered that such lights offended the spirits of the sands. I recorded those words in my notebook at the time with a small private amusement. The first week passed in the ordinary hardships of desert work. Heat by day that pressed upon the skull like a physical weight. Nights that fell suddenly, with stars so sharp and multitudinous that a man felt diminished beneath them. The camels groaned and spat. The men sang under their breath as they walked. We made steady progress inland, pegging out our camps, taking bearings at dawn and dusk, noting the low thorn scrub, the occasional dry wadi, the rare blessed wells where we refilled our skins. It was on the 9th day, when the character of the land changed, that the first unease, so slight I barely marked it, crept upon us. The thorn gave way to long, undulating fields of sand, not the coarse, wind-chopped stuff of coastal dunes, but fine, pale, and powdery, like ground bone. The locals called this region Ugada, and when Henderson announced our intention to press into it, 2 of the camelmen exchanged a glance I did not then understand. That evening, as we sat about a low fire of camel dung, I shared a cigarette with Marsh. The stars were so numerous that the sky seemed more light than dark between them, and the sand radiated the day's stored heat up through the canvas beneath us. Marsh had his jacket off, sleeves rolled, his hair still carrying the faint scent of bay rum from Berbera. He stared eastward, where the dunes rose and fell like the backs of sleeping beasts. "You have family in England, Cartwright?" he asked me. His voice had that languid drawl I had first mistaken for indolence, and later learned concealed a watchful mind. a sister in Surrey, I said, a father in Kent, though the doctors said he would not last the winter when I sailed. He nodded, offered me his matchbox. I have a wife in Winchester. She hates the cold. Every letter of hers complains of it. I promised her that when this posting is done, I shall take her to Naples, or perhaps Algiers, somewhere with warmth that is not so damned empty as this. He gestured with his cigarette to the surrounding sand, smiling, but there was a tightness to it. "You think this empty?" I said. "Look at it. There is a sort of grandeur in such simplicity." "Empty," he repeated quietly, "is perhaps the wrong word. There are places men are not meant to linger. I sometimes think this is one of them." One of the camel men, Yusuf, passed close enough to hear. He was a tall, spare fellow, with eyes that seemed always half turned inward, as if listening to something beneath the surface of speech. "This land is not empty, Sahib," he said in careful English. "It is only that it does not care for us." Marsh chuckled, but there was no amusement in it. "You see, even the camels are poets in this country." I remember that moment now with a tenderness I did not feel then. Two men, smoke curling up to the indifferent stars, speaking of wives and winters, while the sand around us cooled and listened. The first anomaly came the following afternoon. We were crossing a long, shallow basin where the dunes had been worn down by some ancient wind, leaving a broad expanse of near-level sand. The sun hung high and white. The air trembled. I walked with Henderson near the front, the compass swinging at his belt. "Do you hear that?" he asked suddenly. I paused. At first, I heard only the usual sounds: the soft pad of camel feet, the creak of leather, the occasional muttered curse in Somali. Then, beneath it, a faint susurration, as of dry leaves stirred by a distant breeze. Yet there was no vegetation here, and the air around us was still. "Probably wind higher up," I said. "These basins can conduct sound oddly." He nodded, but his brow remained furrowed. The sound persisted for perhaps a minute, then faded. I marked the time and location in my notebook, more from habit than concern. That night, the air remained unaccountably warm long after sundown. The men lay upon their blankets, sleeves rolled, muttering. Even the camels seemed restless, shifting and snorting, their long necks turning to look out into the darkness more often than usual. At some point past midnight, I woke to an absence that I could not immediately name. It was the silence. In the desert, there is always some small sound: a camel's breath, the faint rasp of sand shifting, a man turning in his sleep. Yet as I lay there, eyes open to the low curve of the tent above me, I heard nothing at all. Not even my own heartbeat seemed to intrude upon that stillness. Then, from somewhere just beyond the circle of our camp, there came a faint whispering. I lay very still, telling myself it was the wind. The words, if words they were, lay just beyond comprehension, like speech heard through a wall. A cadence, a rise and fall that suggested language without yielding sense. I waited for it to resolve into some recognizable tongue, Arabic perhaps, or Somali, but it did not. After perhaps half a minute, it ceased as abruptly as it had begun. In the morning, I said nothing. I had no wish to be thought fanciful. Besides, when I emerged, the camp was already alive with the small irritations of travel. One of the water skins had leaked, and Henderson was berating the quartermaster. The ordinary business of survival has a way of pushing aside private oddities. Had I understood the warning that lay in that first whisper, I might have urged a return then and there. but I was young, and the sand had not yet shown us its teeth. Over the next 3 days, the landscape grew more austere. The dunes rose higher, their slopes steeper, their crests sharper. The sand itself became a finer still, so that it flowed beneath our boots like water, swallowing each step. The sun burned without mercy. The horizon shimmered. We saw no birds, no insects, not even the hardy scrub that had marked the earlier stages of our journey. The world narrowed to sky and sand, and the slow, grinding labor of forward motion. The men grew quieter. Laughter, which had once sprung up around the evening fires, became rare. Yusuf, who had been the most talkative of the camel men, now spoke only when spoken to. Once, as he adjusted a pack saddle, I heard him muttering under his breath, a prayer, or perhaps an incantation. When he saw me watching, he fell silent. On the 12th night, the whispering returned. I woke from a shallow, heat-broken sleep with a distinct sensation that someone had spoken my name just outside the tent. My hand went at once to the rifle beside me. The canvas walls glowed faintly with starlight. The air was still. "Who is there?" I said softly. No answer. Yet from the sand, from the very ground itself, there came that same low susurration, closer now, more insistent. It seemed to circle the camp, never quite approaching, never quite receding. I heard, or thought I heard, snatches of familiar phrases. My sister's laugh, my father's cough, the clipped tones of my instructors at Chatham. All of it so faint that I could not be certain it was not some trick of memory. I lay rigid, every muscle taut, until the sky paled and the sounds of waking men and beasts rose to drown that other, softer chorus. When I emerged, I saw at once that I had not been alone in my unease. Dr. Avery stood by the embers of the fire, a cup of tea in his hand, his face drawn. He was a spare, methodical man, given to dry humor, not easily rattled. Yet his eyes that morning had the look of someone who had slept with his thoughts too long. "You look as though you have seen a ghost, Doctor," I said, attempting lightness. He glanced at me sharply. "Do you hear them?" he asked. "Hear whom?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "It is nothing. I am tired. This heat does strange things to a man's mind." Later, as we walked, he fell into step beside me. "In medical school," he said quietly, "we were told that sensory hallucinations may accompany dehydration, heat stroke, certain fevers. The mind, starved of ordinary stimuli, manufactures its own." "You think that is what this is?" I asked. "What else could it be?" he said. "I heard my mother last night. She has been dead these 15 years. I heard her scolding me for staying up with my books, precisely as she used to. The cadence, the little sigh she made between words. You see, the mind is a treacherous organ. I wanted to tell him that I, too, had heard voices, but something in his tone, defensive, almost pleading, stayed me. We walked on in silence. That afternoon, we came upon the first physical sign that something was amiss. Henderson had sent 2 of the Askaris, Karim and Bilal, ahead on a slight rise to scout the lay of the dunes. They vanished over the crest. 10 minutes passed, then 20. There was no sign of them. Henderson's jaw tightened. "They know better than to wander," he muttered. He signaled to Yusuf. "Take 2 men. Fetch them back." Yusuf hesitated, his gaze flicking to the east, where the dunes rose like frozen waves. "Saheb," he said, "it is better we do not spread out. The sand is sand," Henderson snapped. "Go." They went. We waited, the sun beating down upon our helmets. The camels shifted, their eyes rolling. I watched the ridgeline, expecting at any moment to see figures appear. Instead, after perhaps half an hour, we heard shouting. We scrambled up the slope, sand sliding under our boots. At the top, I stopped short. On the far side of the dune, the sand fell away in a long, smooth decline to another basin. There, perhaps 50 yards from the base of the slope, lay Karim and Bilal, or rather, their uniforms. Their boots, their tunics, their belts, even their turbans lay upon the sand as if their owners had undressed in great haste and then vanished. The garments were arranged with a disquieting neatness. Boots side by side, trousers folded, tunics placed above them. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no disturbance of the sand beyond a few footprints leading to that spot and none leading away. Yusuf stood a few yards away, his face ashen. "We found them like this," he said. "There are no tracks, Sahib. They walked here, and then—" He spread his hands helplessly. Henderson descended, his movements stiff. He prodded the clothing with the toe of his boot, then crouched to examine the sand. I followed, my heart pounding. The footprints were clear enough, 2 sets side by side, coming down the slope, crossing the basin, ending at the garments. Beyond that, the sand lay unmarked, its fine surface unbroken. "It is not possible," I said. "They must have gone on. The wind—" "There has been no wind," Avery said quietly behind me. He knelt, running his hand over the surface. "The sand is settled, no disturbance at all." We searched the immediate area, calling their names until our throats were raw. There was no reply, no tracks, no bodies, only the neatly placed uniforms, still holding in the folds of cloth the warmth of the men who had worn them. In the end, we gathered the garments and buried them, saying what prayers each man knew. It felt obscene to consign empty cloth to the ground, yet to leave them lying upon the sand was worse. That night, no one spoke of hallucinations. The rational mind, however, is a stubborn thing. In the days that followed, we constructed explanations, each more strained than the last. Perhaps the men had fled, disrobing for some reason, though why they would do so in that pitiless sun, no one could say. Perhaps they had fallen into some concealed sinkhole, though the sand gave no sign of such disturbance. Henderson proposed that they had been taken by raiders who had smoothed the sand behind them, though we had seen no sign of other men for days, and no raider would trouble to remove a man's boots. We argued in low voices over the evening fire, the camels kneeling in a restless semicircle around us. The Somali men listened, their expressions closed. "It is the Arjin," Yusuf said at last, when our English speculations had run dry. "The what?" Marsh asked. "The spirits of the sand," Yusuf replied. "They are old, older than the clans, older than the Prophet, older than the first men who crossed this place. They do not like our noise, our iron, our maps. They whisper to us. Sometimes they call us by name. If a man listens, they take him." "Superstition," Henderson said shortly. "We have lost 2 men to some natural hazard we have not yet understood. That is all." Yusuf met his gaze with a curious pity. "You may call it what you wish, Sahib," he said, "but we should not be here. Had we turned back then, perhaps I would now be an old man with an odd tale of missing men and strange whispers, nothing more. But duty, pride, and the inertia of an expedition already committed drove us onward. The survey had its schedule. The maps must be made. As we pressed deeper, the phenomena multiplied. The whispering, once an occasional intrusion, became a nightly presence. It would begin shortly after the last voices in camp had fallen silent, a faint murmur at the edge of hearing, rising and falling as if in conversation. Sometimes it seemed to circle us, moving from one quarter to another. At other times, it pressed close, so that I felt the hairs rise along my arms and the back of my neck. On the fourth such night, I heard my own voice among them. I lay awake, staring at the dim outline of the tent pole, when I heard, just beyond the canvas, a phrase I had uttered the previous day, repeated in my own tone, my own inflection. The barometer is dropping faster than it should. It was followed by a low chuckle in Marsh's unmistakable drawl, though Marsh lay snoring 2 yards away. Then my father's cough. Then the high, thin laughter of a girl I had known at school. Each sound was precise, as if a gramophone record had been set to play, but all were woven together into that larger, ceaseless susurration. I pressed my hands against my ears. It made no difference. By day, the desert offered no relief. The dunes grew higher still, their slopes steeper, so that each ascent became a small campaign. The sun hammered at us. The air shimmered. The men's lips cracked. Their eyes grew bloodshot. We rationed water more strictly. The camels, usually stoic, began to balk, refusing to move in certain directions, their legs splayed, their mouths frothing. It was on the 17th day, when our rations of flour had grown meager and our tempers shorter, that the desert showed us its other trick. We had halted at midday, too exhausted to press on through the fiercest heat. The men lay in what little shade the camels afforded, cloths over their faces. Henderson and I sat a little apart, the theodolite between us, its brass fittings too hot to touch. The air was utterly still. Without warning, the sand beneath the camels began to vibrate. At first, I thought it was my own pulse in my ears. But then one of the beasts lurched to its feet with a strangled cry, its eyes rolling. The others followed, their long necks craning, their nostrils flaring. The men scrambled up, shouting. The vibration increased, a low, thrumming sensation that traveled up through my boots into my bones. The sand around us seemed to ripple, not with the motion of wind, but as if something beneath it were moving, passing under us. The surface did not break, yet waves ran through it. Subtle but unmistakable, like the skin of some great buried creature. "Earth tremor," Avery said, though his voice lacked conviction. "A minor one." "Then why is there no sound?" Marsh demanded. "No cracking, no falling sand?" The ripple passed beneath us, moved on, and was gone. The camels stood panting, their sides heaving, their eyes fixed on some point beyond the horizon. The men crossed themselves, or whispered prayers in Arabic, or simply stared. Later, as we resumed our march, I noticed something else. Our footprints, which had always before remained visible at least for a time, now seemed to fade more quickly. I watched as the prints of the man before me, clear and sharp in the sand, softened, blurred, and vanished, as if some invisible hand smoothed them away. By this stage, my rational explanations were fraying. I told myself that heat, exhaustion, and hunger were playing tricks upon my senses. I repeated Avery's words about the treachery of the mind. Yet the sand under my boots, the murmurs in my ears, the vanished footprints, these were not phantoms of the brain alone. Were they? The turning point came on the 19th night. We had made camp in a shallow depression between two high dunes, more from necessity than choice. The wind had risen slightly at dusk, a dry, rasping breath that drove fine sand into every crevice. We ate in silence, each man wrapped in his own thoughts. The lanterns cast small, wavering circles of light. As we prepared to sleep, Henderson ordered that one lantern be left burning, its glass chimney hooded to conserve fuel. He had grown increasingly short in his manner, his usual calm eroded by the accumulating oddities. I had seen him twice that day, start at sounds no one else heard. I took the second watch that night, from midnight to 2. When Avery shook my shoulder, his face loomed pale in the lantern glow. "Your turn," he said. His hand lingered a moment on my arm. "Do not listen too closely, Cartwright. That is the trick of it, I think." Outside, the air had cooled, though not as much as it should have. The sand still radiated a faint warmth. The sky was cloudless, the stars hard and bright. The lantern cast its small circle. Beyond it, the dunes rose in shadow. For the first hour, nothing occurred. I walked the perimeter of the camp, rifle in hand, listening to the ordinary sounds of sleeping men and beasts. Once, I thought I heard the faintest of whispers, but when I held my breath, it faded. Near 1 o'clock, as I stood at the northern edge of camp, looking out over the dark sweep of sand, the lantern behind me went out. There was no gust of wind, no warning. One moment, its light lay upon the tents and the huddled forms of the camels. The next, darkness fell like a dropped curtain. I turned at once, heart racing. "Who did that?" I called softly. No answer. The camp lay still. I could make out the faint shapes of the tents, the pale smudges of blankets. The stars provided some light, but after the lamp's brightness, it seemed very little. I took a step back towards the center of camp, intending to relight the lantern. My boot struck something soft. I looked down. Henderson's boots lay upon the sand. His trousers were folded beside them. His tunic, with its brass buttons, lay neatly above. His pistol belt rested on top, the holster empty. For a moment, I could not make sense of what I saw. My mind refused to accept that the garments were empty. I waited for him to sit up, to curse me for fumbling in the dark. But there was only the sound of my own breathing, suddenly very loud. "Henderson?" My voice cracked. "Captain?" No answer. The whispering began. It rose from the sand around my feet, from the dark hollows between the dunes, from the very air. Not faint now, not at the edge of hearing, but close, pressing, a multitude of voices speaking all at once, overlapping, some high, some low, some in English, some in tongues I did not know. I heard my own name repeated again and again in the voices of my father, my sister, my tutors, my childhood friends. "Cartwright," in my mother's soft tone. "Cartwright," in Marsh's drawl. "Cartwright," in Avery's precise diction. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over another pile of clothing. Marsh's this time, the familiar cut of his jacket, the handkerchief he always kept in the breast pocket. Beyond it, in the dim starlight, I saw other shapes upon the sand. Boots, belts, tunics, turbans. For an instant, the camp was a graveyard of garments, each arranged with that same obscene neatness, as if their owners had stepped carefully out of themselves and gone elsewhere. "God help us," I whispered. The whispering swelled, a tide of sound. Phrases I had spoken days before repeated back to me. Fragments of conversations, of songs half remembered, of prayers I had not uttered since boyhood. They wove together into a single rising murmur that seemed to press against my skull from within. Something brushed my bare hand. The sand beneath my fingers felt suddenly impossibly cold, as if a frost had settled upon it. The hairs on my arms and neck stood up. The air around me thickened, as if the very atmosphere had grown viscous. Then, very distinctly, just beside my ear, in my own voice, I heard the words, "It is time to lie down." The terror that seized me then was not the wild, flailing panic of a man surprised, but a deep, almost seductive weariness. My limbs felt heavy. My eyelids drooped. The soft, insistent murmur all around me promised rest, release, an end to heat and thirst and fear. Had Avery not shouted at that moment, I do not know whether I would be here to write these words. "Cartwright!" His voice cut through the murmurs like a whip crack. "Do not listen! Move, man!" I felt hands seize my shoulders, dragging me back. The contact broke something. The heaviness in my limbs lessened. The whispers receded a fraction. I found myself on my knees beside one of the tents. Avery's face loomed above me, pale and strained, his eyes wide. "Do you see them?" I gasped. He shook his head. "I see nothing but the dark, but I heard—" He swallowed. "I heard my father. He has been in his grave these 20 years. We must get the men up, now." We went from blanket to blanket, shaking shoulders, calling names. Some of the men woke at once, eyes wild. Others were harder to rouse, as if sunk in some deep, unnatural sleep. The whispering ebbed and flowed, sometimes so loud I could scarcely hear my own voice, sometimes fading to a distant murmur. 2 of the Somali camel men were gone, their blankets empty, their garments folded beside them. Of Henderson and Marsh, there was no sign but their clothing upon the sand. In the confusion, one of the petrol lanterns was knocked over. It struck a rock, its glass chimney shattering. For an instant, the spilled fuel flared, a brief, bright blossom of flame. In that light, I saw the sand around the empty garments move. It did not shift as it would under wind, but seemed to draw inward, flowing towards the piles of clothing, rising up around them in small, silent eddies, as if something beneath were inhaling. The flame guttered and went out. In the sudden darkness, the whispering surged. We fled. There was no command, no ordered retreat. Men grabbed what they could, rifles, water skins, a handful of cartridges, and stumbled up the nearest slope. The camels, as if seized by the same blind panic, lurched to their feet and bolted, some in our direction, others off into the night. Sand slid under our boots. Men fell, were dragged up, fell again. Behind us, the murmurs followed, a pursuing tide. Once I glanced back. In the starlight, I saw the hollow where we had camped, now a darker shadow within shadows. The sand there seemed to boil, rising and falling in slow, unnatural waves. By the time we reached the crest of the dune, my lungs burned, my legs shook, and my mouth was dry as ash. I threw myself down, chest heaving. The men collapsed around me, some sobbing, some muttering prayers. Avery knelt, his hands on his knees, his head bowed. The whispering had diminished, but it had not ceased. It hovered at the edge of hearing like the memory of a dream. "We cannot stay here," Avery said hoarsely. "We must get out of this place. Now, before dawn." "Which way?" I asked. The dunes in every direction looked alike, cold and pale under the stars. He closed his eyes a moment, then pointed west. "We came from there. We go back the way we came. We have water for perhaps 3 days if we ration it, less if we lose more men." Of Henderson and Marsh, no one spoke. Their absence hung over us, a void no words could bridge. We stumbled on through the remainder of the night, following the faint line of our own fading footprints where we could, guessing where we could not. The stars wheeled overhead. The sand underfoot grew colder, so cold that the soles of my boots ached. The whispering ebbed as the first pale light touched the eastern sky, then ceased altogether with the sunrise, as if some curtain had been drawn. In the days that followed, the desert did not relent, but it changed its manner of assault. The whispering did not return with the former intensity, though now and then, at the edge of sleep, I thought I heard my name. Instead, we were beset by the more prosaic enemies of heat and thirst and exhaustion. We had lost 2 of our water skins in the chaos. Our rations were pitiful. The camels, those that remained with us, were gaunt and stumbling. Men's lips cracked, their tongues swelled. Avery doled out what little quinine and salts he had left, but there was only so much he could do. We moved mostly by night now, resting in shallow hollows during the day, covering ourselves with blankets to escape the worst of the sun. The dunes, which had seemed so uniform on our inward journey, now revealed subtle differences. A familiar curve here, a distinctive ripple there. We clung to these small landmarks as drowning men to driftwood. The men spoke little. When they did, their voices were hoarse. Once, I heard Yusuf mutter, "It is letting us go," and shuddered at the implication. On the 3rd day of our retreat, one of the Askaris, a young man named Suleiman, collapsed and did not rise. His skin was hot, his eyes glassy. He muttered in his own tongue, words I did not understand, though I recognized the cadence of a man arguing with someone no one else could see. "We must leave him," Avery said quietly. "If we try to carry him, we all die." The decision was made with a brutal swiftness that haunts me still. We left a canteen beside him, though we could ill spare it, and a rifle with a single cartridge. As we turned away, I heard him call out in perfect, unaccented English, "Do not go, Edward." None of us was named Edward. That night, as we huddled in a shallow hollow, the stars wheeling overhead, Avery spoke at last of what we had seen. "I can no longer pretend this is some collective madness," he said. "I am a man of science. I have dissected bodies, observed fevers, catalogued deliria. This is something else." "What then?" I asked. My voice sounded thin in the vastness. "I do not know," he said. "There are phenomena we do not yet comprehend. The mind, the world, the spaces between. Perhaps there is some property of this sand, this place, that stores impressions, sounds, voices, like a phonograph cylinder, but more subtle. Perhaps we walked into a region where such impressions accumulate, and it replayed them to us, used them to draw us in. Like a fisherman with bait," I said. "Yes," he replied, and once we were close enough, it took what it wanted. "What did it want?" I asked, though part of me did not wish to hear any answer. He stared out over the dark dunes. "Men," he said simply. "Voices, memories. We are, after all, little more than the sum of what we have heard and said and thought. If there is something in that sand that feeds upon such things, then we are a feast." We fell silent. The wind, at last, had risen, a low, steady breath that moved the sand in small ripples. It sounded, for a moment, like distant whispering, and my heart lurched before reason reasserted itself. On the 5th day of our retreat, we sighted the first scrub we had seen in over a week, a few stunted thorn bushes clinging to a low rise. I could have wept at the sight. Soon after, we found a shallow, brackish pool, its surface scummed with algae. It was the sweetest water I have ever tasted. We staggered into Berbera 11 days after we had set out for the interior, a ragged, sun-blackened remnant of our former party. Of the original 16 Europeans and Askaris, only 7 of us remained. The camel men, those who had survived, walked with the dazed tread of men who had seen their worst fears made flesh. The port, with its whitewashed buildings, its shouting stevedores, its reek of fish and coal smoke, seemed unreal. Men stared as we passed. Someone went to fetch the resident. In the cool dimness of the residency, I watched as Henderson's absence was explained in dry bureaucratic terms. Lost in the desert during a sandstorm, the report would say. Presumed dead. Marsh, Karim, Bilal, the others, all subsumed into that same vague phrase. There was no place in the official forms for folded garments and whispering sands. The resident, a florid man with a walrus moustache, listened to Avery's account, such as he dared give it with a frown. "You say you experienced auditory disturbances?" he asked. "Voices?" "Heat stroke," Avery said at once. "Exhaustion. We were not in our right minds." He met my eye as he spoke, a silent plea. I understood. To tell the truth as we had experienced it would be to invite ridicule at best, confinement at worst. Men in our position were expected to be rational, steady, reliable. There was no room for tales of sand spirits in the ledger books of empire. "Very well," the resident said. "The loss of so many men is regrettable, of course. But the survey must continue. We cannot allow superstition to dictate our movements. The Italians would be only too pleased." Later, in the small bare room allotted to me, I sat with my notebook open, pen in hand. The official report I had already drafted. All figures and bearings and neutral phrases. Now, in the quiet, I began a second account, one no one had asked for, and no one, I thought, would ever read. I wrote of the first whispers, of the vanished footprints, of the empty garments. I described the sensation of cold sand under my hand, the weight of that insidious weariness, the way my own voice had been turned against me. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the ink dried upon the nib. When I finished, I hid that notebook at the bottom of my trunk, beneath uniforms and maps. I told myself I would look at it again in a week or a month when the immediacy of the experience had faded. Perhaps then I would see it for what it was, the fevered imaginings of a mind pushed to its limits. I did not open it again for 10 years. In the intervening years, life resumed its outward course. I was posted to other colonies, other frontiers. I married, briefly, and was widowed by influenza. I rose a rank, then another. My hair thinned. My hands, once so steady over a theodolite, developed a slight tremor. Yet the desert did not leave me. There were small things at first. In the quiet of an English night, far from any sand, I would wake with the distinct sensation that someone had spoken my name just outside the door. In crowded rooms, amid the murmur of conversation, I would sometimes hear for an instant my father's cough or Marsh's lazy drawl, though both men were long dead. Once, in a London street, a gust of wind sent a swirl of dust skittering along the pavement. For a moment, the sound it made was not the rasp of grit on stone, but that soft, insistent whisper from the dunes. I froze, heart hammering, until a passing omnibus jolted me back to the present. On another occasion, in 1931, I attended a lecture at the Royal Geographical Society on the subject of acoustic phenomena in deserts. The speaker, a thin, earnest German, spoke of booming dunes and singing sands, of certain grains that, when set in motion, produced low, sustained tones. He played recordings, deep, organ-like notes, eerie but explicable. During the questions, I rose and asked whether he had ever encountered reports of more complex sounds, of voices, for instance. He smiled indulgently. "There are many tales," he said. "The mind is very suggestible in such environments. Dehydration, isolation, the monotony of the landscape, all these contribute. Men hear what they expect to hear, or what they fear." The audience chuckled. I sat down, my face hot. That night, in my small room off Gloucester Road, I took out the old notebook from Berbera and read it through for the first time since I had written it. The words were as I remembered, calm, precise, almost clinical. There was no hysteria in them, no wild speculation. Yet as I read, the old sensations returned with a vividness that left me shaking. The weight of the hot air, the feel of cold sand, the sound of my own voice coming from the dark. I wrote to Avery, now a senior physician in India, to ask whether he ever thought of that journey. His reply, when it came, was brief. "I think of it more often than is good for me," he wrote. "I hear my father in the monsoon rain. I hear Henderson when the wind moves through the teak. I have told no one here. They would say it is the fever. Perhaps it is. Perhaps that is kinder." We did not correspond on the subject again. There are some wounds that talking only keeps open. A few years later, in a club off Pall Mall, I overheard two younger officers discussing a proposed survey of the horde. One of them mentioned, with a laugh, that the camel men were refusing to go beyond a certain point, muttering about spirits in the sand. "Old wives' tales," his companion said. "Besides, the last party that went that way came back with their minds quite intact, did they not?" I did not correct him. From time to time, I sought out scientific papers, obscure monographs, any scrap of writing that might cast some light upon what we had experienced. There were references to so-called desert voices in the accounts of 19th century explorers, usually dismissed as hallucinations. I found a curious passage in a French officer's journal from Algeria, describing a night when the dunes murmured as if 1,000 men whispered prayers at once. He had attributed it to wind. I tried, for a while, to convince myself that we too had been victims of such a natural phenomenon, amplified by stress and thirst. It was a comforting thought. But then I would remember the neat piles of clothing, the untouched sand around them, the way the lantern had gone out without a breath of air, and the comfort would dissolve. The most disturbing incidents were those which came without warning, in the midst of ordinary life. Once, during a visit to my sister in Surrey, I was sitting in her garden at dusk, the air cool, the scent of roses heavy. The children were playing on the lawn, their voices bright. My sister sat beside me, knitting. The world could not have been further from the Somali interior. Without prelude, I heard, very distinctly, just behind my right ear, in Henderson's crisp tone, "We should not have come here." I turned so sharply that my neck twinged. There was no one there. The children continued to play. My sister did not look up from her knitting. "Did you hear that?" I asked her, my voice too loud. "Hear what?" she said. "Nothing," I replied. It was nothing. That night, I woke from a dream in which I had been walking again between those high dunes, the stars a hard glitter above. The sand under my boots had felt cold, the air heavy. The whispering had risen, not from the ground this time, but from the hedges, the flower beds, the very bricks of my sister's house. Another time, during the war, I took shelter in an underground station during a raid. The tunnels were crowded, the air thick with the smell of fear and damp wool. People spoke in low voices or sat in exhausted silence. Somewhere, a child cried. As the bombs fell above, the sound of distant explosions filtered down, muffled but insistent. Between them, in the brief pauses, there was another sound, a low, collective murmur as of many voices speaking at once. For a moment, my heart lurched and I was back under the desert stars. The cold sweat that broke out upon my skin had nothing to do with the chill of the tunnel. I have lived long enough now to know that the human mind is both resilient and fragile. It can endure much, but it rarely escapes unmarked. The desert left its mark upon me in the form of sounds that will not always stay where they belong. I have told this full account to very few. A younger man once, in a bar in Aden, who spoke of strange lights he had seen over the empty quarter. An old Somali sergeant, years after Berbera, who asked me with a curious half-smile whether the Arjun had spoken to me. To most, I have said nothing. They would call it madness or superstition or the residue of sunstroke. Perhaps they would be right. Perhaps there is nothing in those sounds but grains and heat and the tricks of a mind pushed to the edge. Yet when I close my eyes at night, in this small room where the ticking of the clock is the loudest sound, I sometimes feel again the weight of that stillness, the way the air itself seemed to listen. What troubles me most after all these years is not the loss of Henderson or Marsh or the others, though their faces come to me often. It is not even the memory of my own voice turned against me. It is a smaller thing, a detail so slight that at the time I barely noted it. On the morning after that last terrible night in the dunes, as we fled westward, I looked back once at the hollow where our camp had been. The rising sun cast long shadows. For an instant, in the slanting light, I thought I saw, upon the crest of the dune we had so hastily climbed, the faint impression of a bare human foot, toes splayed, heel dug in, as if someone had stood there watching us go. There were no other tracks leading to or from it. It may have been a trick of the light. It may have been nothing at all. Yet sometimes, in the thin hours before dawn, when the city's noises have sunk to a distant hum and the house around me is very still, I feel again the cold of that sand under my hand. And in the silence, if I listen too closely, I hear, far off and patient, the desert whispering back the words I have spoken in this room.